This audio recording was found inside a sealed waterproof case that washed ashore near Devil's Point 3 days after Hurricane Miranda devastated the Atlantic coast. The case belonged to Captain Elena Santos, age 32, licensed commercial vessel operator, and marine salvage specialist with 14 years of experience in coastal waters. The timestamp shows this recording began at 11:23 p.m. on October 12, 2024, during the height of the storm. What follows is the complete, unedited audio file that explains why Devil's Point Lighthouse has been permanently closed to maritime traffic and why 17 vessels were lost in a single night during Hurricane Miranda. Elena Santos owned a 42-foot salvage vessel called the Mercy's Hand and specialized in recovering disabled boats and underwater salvage operations along the northeastern seaboard. She lived alone in a converted warehouse apartment overlooking Portsmouth Harbor, having dedicated her adult life to the sea after losing her father and 2 brothers in a fishing accident when she was 19. Elena was dealing with mounting debt from equipment repairs and insurance premiums, and this final salvage job of the season was supposed to provide enough income to keep her business operational through the winter months. She had been hired by Atlantic Maritime Insurance to assess storm damage to a luxury yacht that had broken anchor during Hurricane Miranda's approach. Elena's typical storm protocols involved comprehensive weather monitoring and conservative safety margins that had kept her alive through dozens of Atlantic storms. She knew every lighthouse, every safe harbor, every navigation beacon from Nova Scotia to the Outer Banks. Elena trusted her instruments, her experience, and most importantly, she trusted that decommissioned lighthouses stayed permanently dark. Devil's Point Light Station had been officially abandoned since 1987, its Fresnel lens removed, its automation systems deactivated, its keeper quarters sealed. Elena had navigated past Devil's Point hundreds of times over 14 years without incident. At exactly 11:23 p.m., Elena noticed something impossible through the driving rain and 50-knot winds. A brilliant white beacon was rotating from the top of Devil's Point Lighthouse. With the precise 15-second timing of an active navigation aid, the light swept across the churning water with mechanical precision, illuminating massive waves crashing against the lighthouse's foundation rocks. Elena stopped her damage assessment report mid-sentence and stared through her wheelhouse windows. She had been monitoring Coast Guard frequencies all evening and heard no mention of emergency beacon activation at Devil's Point. Elena tried to rationalize what she was seeing. Perhaps the Coast Guard had quietly reactivated the lighthouse for storm operations without broadcasting the change. Perhaps it was an automatic emergency system triggered by extreme weather conditions. Perhaps her charts were outdated and the lighthouse had been secretly returned to service. But even as Elena formed these explanations, her voice carried deep uncertainty when she spoke into her recording device. The lighthouse beam was growing brighter and more defined as Elena's vessel was pushed closer to shore by hurricane-force winds. Each time the light swept across her position, she could see details of the rocky coastline that should have been invisible in the storm. The beam illuminated Devil's Point's infamous reef system where dozens of ships had been wrecked in the 19th century before the lighthouse was first built. Those jagged rocks extended 200 yards offshore in a pattern that would destroy any vessel attempting to approach what appeared to be safe harbor. Elena felt her pulse accelerating as a horrifying realization formed. The lighthouse beam wasn't pointing towards safe passage around the reef system. It was aimed directly at the most dangerous rocks, creating the optical illusion of a protected harbor entrance where none existed. Elena grabbed her marine radio and broadcast an urgent warning to any vessels in the area, but received only static and interference. Then she heard something that made her blood freeze, a weak, crackling distress call from another vessel. The transmission was barely audible through the storm static. "Mayday, Mayday, this is the fishing vessel Aurora's Dream. We're taking on water and following the lighthouse beacon to safe harbor at Devil's Point. Estimated arrival in 15 minutes." Elena knew the Aurora's Dream. It was operated by the Kowalski family, 3 generations of Polish-American fishermen who worked the same waters Elena did. She tried frantically to raise them on multiple radio frequencies, screaming warnings about the reef system, but her transmissions seemed to vanish into the electromagnetic chaos of the hurricane. Elena made the decision that would trap her in the most terrifying night of her life. Instead of fleeing to open water, she turned the Mercy's Hand toward Devil's Point to attempt a rescue of the Aurora's Dream. She knew the reef system well enough to navigate it in daylight with calm seas, but approaching it at night in hurricane conditions was nearly suicidal. Elena convinced herself that her salvage experience and intimate knowledge of these waters gave her the best chance of preventing a tragedy. As Elena fought through mountainous seas toward Devil's Point, she noticed that the lighthouse beam was tracking her movement. When she adjusted her course to port, the light shifted to maintain focus on her vessel. When she reduced engine power to test her theory, the beam intensified and began flashing in rapid bursts. Whatever controlled that light knew her exact position and was actively monitoring her approach. Elena's rational mind rejected what her observations were telling her, but the evidence was undeniable. Elena's marine electronics began malfunctioning as she entered the waters around Devil's Point. Her GPS coordinates flickered between accurate readings and impossible locations that showed her vessel inland or thousands of miles away. Her depth finder registered readings that changed from 200 feet to 20 feet to infinity in random patterns. Most disturbing, her radio began receiving transmissions that shouldn't exist. She could hear multiple distress calls from vessels she recognized: the Miss Catherine, the Second, Chance, the Mary's Pride, boats that had been lost in these waters years or decades earlier. The voices on these impossible transmissions were calling for help, reporting engine failures and hull breaches, requesting emergency assistance. Elena recognized some of the voices as mariners she had known personally, men who had died in these waters long before she began her career. The transmissions overlapped and repeated in patterns that suggested they were recorded loops rather than live broadcasts. Elena realized she was hearing an audio trap designed to lure rescue vessels into the Devil's Point reef system. Elena attempted to retreat to safer waters, but discovered that the hurricane had intensified beyond normal meteorological patterns. The storm surge was pushing her toward shore with irresistible force, while the wind patterns created a perfect funnel that made escape impossible. Every course she plotted led her closer to Devil's Point Lighthouse, as if the storm itself was being controlled by something that wanted vessels to approach the deadly reef system. Elena's radar showed 17 other vessel signatures converging on Devil's Point from all directions. Large commercial fishing boats, private yachts, Coast Guard cutters, and cargo vessels, all apparently drawn by the lighthouse beacon or responding to false distress calls. Elena tried to contact these other vessels, but reached only more recordings of dead voices asking for help. She realized she was witnessing a maritime disaster of unprecedented scale orchestrated by something that controlled both the lighthouse and the storm itself. At 11:47 p.m., Elena made visual contact with Devil's Point Lighthouse. The structure was exactly as she remembered from dozens of previous passes: a weathered stone tower with broken windows, a collapsed keeper's quarters, and an empty lamp room that had been dark for 37 years. But the brilliant beacon continued to rotate from the top of the lighthouse, casting its deadly illumination across the reef system. Elena could see that the light source had no visible mechanism. It appeared to emanate from empty air within the lamp room. Elena anchored the Mercy's hand in the most sheltered position she could, find and prepared to document whatever was happening at Devil's Point. She activated multiple recording devices and began a systematic log of everything she observed. The lighthouse beam was maintaining perfect timing and intensity, despite having no power source, no maintenance, and no operator. The structure itself showed no signs of recent human activity, yet somehow housed an active navigation beacon that was luring vessels to their destruction. The first vessel to reach the reef system was the Aurora's Dream. Elena watched helplessly as the Kowalski family's fishing boat followed the lighthouse beam directly into the jagged rocks. The impact was catastrophic. The steel hull split open like paper and the vessel sank within minutes. Elena could hear the screams of the crew over her radio, but when she tried to respond, her transmissions were blocked by increasing interference. She launched her emergency inflatable to attempt to rescue, but the seas were too violent for a small boat to survive. As Elena fought to maintain her position, more vessels arrived and met the same fate. A Coast Guard cutter following false distress signals struck the reef system at full speed and broke apart immediately. A luxury yacht seeking shelter from the hurricane was crushed against the rocks by 30-foot waves. One by one, 17 vessels were systematically destroyed by the Devil's Point reef system, guided to their doom by the impossible lighthouse beacon. Elena realized she was witnessing something that defied natural explanation. The lighthouse was operating without power, maintenance, or human control. The storm was behaving in ways that violated meteorological principles. The radio transmissions were voices of the dead, calling new victims to join them. She was trapped in a supernatural maritime disaster that had been repeating itself for decades, claiming vessels and lives to feed something ancient and hungry that lived within Devil's Point Lighthouse. The lighthouse beam suddenly focused directly on Elena's vessel with blinding intensity. She could feel heat radiating from the light source, despite the October cold and hurricane winds. The beam held steady on her position, while all other vessels were destroyed around her. Elena realized she had been selected for a different fate than the others. The entity controlling Devil's Point wanted her alive, wanted her to witness the complete destruction of 17 vessels, wanted her to carry the knowledge of what happened during Hurricane Miranda. Elena tried to start her engines to flee, but the Mercy's hand would not respond to any controls. Her electrical systems showed power, her engines turned over normally, but the vessel remained motionless as if held in place by invisible anchors. She was being forced to watch and record as the last survivors in the water were consumed by waves and pulled beneath the surface. Within 2 hours, Elena was the only living person left in the waters around Devil's Point. The lighthouse beam released its focus on Elena's vessel at exactly 2:15 a.m. Her engines immediately responded to controls and she found herself free to navigate. The storm began to dissipate with unnatural speed, hurricane winds dropping to moderate breeze in minutes. The radio interference cleared and Elena could reach Coast Guard stations, but when she reported the disaster, she was told that no other vessels had been in the area that night. According to all official records, Elena had been alone near Devil's Point during Hurricane Miranda. Elena spent the remaining hours until dawn searching for survivors, but found only debris from the 17 destroyed vessels. She recovered life rings from the Aurora's Dream, navigation equipment from the Coast Guard cutter, personal effects from the luxury yacht. She documented everything with photographs and GPS coordinates, building an irrefutable record of the maritime disaster she had witnessed. But when she returned to port and reported her findings, she discovered that none of the destroyed vessels were officially missing. The Aurora's Dream was listed as safe in harbor in Boston. The Coast Guard cutter was documented as being on patrol 300 miles to the south. The luxury yacht was recorded as being in dry dock for winter storage in Connecticut. According to all maritime traffic control systems, shipping databases, and Coast Guard records, the vessels Elena had watched being destroyed at Devil's Point had never been in those waters at all. She was accused of filing false reports, experiencing storm-induced hallucinations, or attempting insurance fraud. Elena's salvage business was destroyed by the controversy. Her maritime license was suspended pending psychological evaluation. Her insurance company refused to cover her claims about Devil's Point, citing lack of corroborating evidence. She was forced to sell her salvage equipment in the Mercy's hand to pay legal costs and debts. Within 6 months, Elena Santos had lost everything she had spent her adult life building because she witnessed something that officially never happened. But Elena knew the truth about Devil's Point Lighthouse. She had physical evidence of the destroyed vessels, recorded audio of the impossible radio, transmissions, detailed logs of meteorological anomalies during Hurricane Miranda. She spent her remaining money investigating the history of Devil's Point and discovered that similar mass maritime disasters had occurred every 15 to 20 years since the lighthouse was first built in 1847. Ships would be drawn to the reef system during severe storms, destroyed in large groups, then erased from official records as if they had never existed. The original lighthouse keeper at Devil's Point was a man named Thaddeus Blackwood, who had been appointed to the position in 1847 despite having no maritime experience. Blackwood was a former asylum superintendent who had been dismissed from his previous position for conducting unauthorized psychological experiments on patients. Historical records showed that Blackwood had requested assignment to the most isolated lighthouse posting available and had specifically asked for Devil's Point despite its reputation for dangerous waters and frequent shipwrecks. Blackwood had lived alone at Devil's Point for 37 years until his death in 1884. During his tenure, the reef system around Devil's Point claimed more vessels than any other location along the northeastern seaboard, despite having an active lighthouse warning system. Investigation of Blackwood's personal effects after his death revealed extensive journals documenting his interactions with what he called the voices of the drowned and his experiments in communion with maritime spirits. Blackwood's journals described his discovery that the dead could be awakened by lighthouse beacons and compelled to lure living vessels to destruction. He documented techniques for amplifying the spiritual energy of shipwreck victims and methods for creating false radio transmissions using the voices of drowned sailors. Most disturbing, Blackwood's final journal entries indicated that he had found a way to merge his consciousness with the lighthouse itself, becoming a permanent guardian of Devil's Point who would continue his work long after his physical death. Elena realized that Thaddeus Blackwood had never left Devil's Point Lighthouse. His spirit had been operating the beacon for 140 years systematically, destroying vessels to harvest the souls of drowned sailors. The lighthouse had become a supernatural trap powered by the accumulated deaths of thousands of mariners whose voices Elena had heard calling for help during Hurricane Miranda. Every vessel lured to destruction strengthened Blackwood's ability to manipulate storms, control electronics, and erase official records of his crimes. Elena understood why she had been spared during the Hurricane Miranda incident. Blackwood needed living witnesses to spread fear of Devil's Point, to create maritime legends that would enhance the psychological power of his trap. Elena's testimony, even when officially discredited, would enter maritime folklore and make future sailors more susceptible to the supernatural influences emanating from Devil's Point Lighthouse. She had been selected to become an unwilling accomplice in Blackwood's eternal campaign of maritime murder. Elena made the decision to return to Devil's Point one final time to confront Thaddeus Blackwood, an attempt to destroy his supernatural lighthouse operation. She used her last savings to charter a small boat and approach Devil's Point during a minor storm on the first anniversary of Hurricane Miranda. She carried explosives intended to demolish the lighthouse structure and recording equipment, to document her final confrontation with the spirit that had destroyed her life. As Elena approached Devil's Point on October 12, 2025, exactly 1 year after witnessing the Hurricane Miranda disaster, the lighthouse beacon activated automatically. The brilliant white light swept across the water with mechanical precision, focusing on Elena's chartered vessel. She could hear Blackwood's voice transmitted through her marine radio, speaking in the cultured accent of a 19th century educated man. Blackwood welcomed Elena back to Devil's Point and thanked her for the maritime legends she had helped create during the past year. Her discredited testimony had enhanced the psychological atmosphere around Devil's Point, making it easier to lure vessels into his trap. He revealed that Elena's survival during Hurricane Miranda had been carefully orchestrated to serve his purposes, and her return to Devil's Point would complete her transformation from unwitting witness to active participant in his supernatural maritime murders. Elena realized that her plan to destroy the lighthouse had been anticipated and manipulated by Blackwood. The explosives she carried would not damage the supernatural beacon, but would instead create a spectacular destruction that would enhance the maritime legends surrounding Devil's Point. Her death would be recorded as a suicide by a mentally unstable former mariner, discrediting her testimony while simultaneously adding to the fearsome reputation of Devil's Point Lighthouse. But Elena had prepared for this possibility. Hidden within her equipment was a second recording device programmed to transmit her final testimony directly to Coast Guard stations, maritime safety organizations, and shipping companies throughout the Atlantic region. Even if Blackwood erased official records of her death, her complete account of Devil's Point would survive in multiple formats and locations. Elena's final act would be to break the cycle of secrecy that had protected Blackwood's supernatural lighthouse operation for over a century. Elena activated her transmission system and began broadcasting the complete truth about Devil's Point Lighthouse. She detailed Blackwood's history, his supernatural abilities, his systematic destruction of vessels, and his manipulation of official records. She provided GPS coordinates for debris from hundreds of destroyed vessels, mathematical analysis of impossible meteorological patterns around Devil's Point, and audio recordings of voices from sailors who had been dead for decades. Blackwood responded by activating the full power of his supernatural lighthouse beacon. The light focused on Elena's vessel with intensity that made metal components glow red hot and caused her recording equipment to smoke and spark. She could feel her consciousness being drawn toward the lighthouse, pulled by the same force that had compelled thousands of mariners to sail directly into the reef system. Elena fought to maintain control of her thoughts while continuing her broadcast, knowing that every second of transmission increased the chances that someone would investigate Devil's Point and expose Blackwood's crimes. The lighthouse beam intensified beyond anything Elena had witnessed during Hurricane Miranda. The light became a physical force that lifted her vessel partially out of the water and held it suspended above the reef system. Elena could see the accumulated wreckage of hundreds of destroyed ships beneath the waves, their hulls forming an underwater graveyard that extended for miles around Devil's Point. She realized that Blackwood's operation had been claiming vessels for much longer than the official lighthouse records indicated, stretching back to pre-colonial maritime traffic. Elena's final transmission described her discovery of the true scope of Blackwood's supernatural maritime murder operation. Devil's Point had been a ship-killing reef system for centuries before the lighthouse was. Built, enhanced by Native American legends of sea spirits that devoured wooden vessels, Blackwood had chosen the location specifically because of its existing supernatural properties, and had amplified them using techniques learned during his psychiatric experiments. He'd created the most deadly maritime trap in Atlantic waters, powered by the accumulated death energy of thousands of sailors. The recording device captured Elena's final words as the lighthouse beam pulled her consciousness into the supernatural beacon system. She became aware of the thousands of trapped souls that powered Blackwood's operation, mariners from every era of Atlantic shipping who had been absorbed into the lighthouse and forced to participate in luring new victims to their deaths. Elena realized she was about to join this ghostly crew, becoming another voice calling false distress signals to guide living vessels into the Devil's Point reef system. But Elena's transmission had accomplished its purpose. Her detailed testimony reached 17 different Coast Guard stations, maritime safety organizations, and shipping companies before Blackwood could interfere with the broadcasts. Multiple agencies began independent investigations of Devil's Point, cross-referencing shipping records with Elena's claims about erased vessel disappearances. The accumulated evidence was overwhelming. Devil's Point Lighthouse had been the site of systematic maritime disasters that had been covered up for over a century. The supernatural lighthouse beacon at Devil's Point was permanently extinguished on November 15, 2025, when a joint Coast Guard and Navy operation detonated explosive charges throughout the lighthouse structure. The detonation revealed hidden chambers within the lighthouse foundation containing the preserved remains of Thaddeus Blackwood and evidence of his supernatural experiments. The destruction of Blackwood's physical anchor points broke his connection to the material world and released the trapped souls of thousands of mariners. Elena Santos's body was never recovered from the waters around Devil's Point, but her transmission saved countless lives by exposing the supernatural maritime trap that had operated there for over a century. Devil's Point was officially designated as a maritime hazard zone with permanent navigation warnings broadcast on all emergency frequencies. The location was removed from all shipping routes and marked on nautical charts as unsuitable for any maritime traffic. But Elena's story contains a final disturbing element that suggests her confrontation with Blackwood may not have been completely successful. The waterproof case containing this recording was found 3 months after the lighthouse destruction washed ashore during a minor storm. The case showed no signs of water damage despite being submerged for months, and the recording device inside was still functioning with a fully charged battery. Most unsettling, the timestamp on Elena's final recording shows a date 3 days in the future from when you are listening to this testimony. The question isn't whether Elena Santos successfully exposed the supernatural horrors of Devil's Point Lighthouse. The question is whether her consciousness survived her absorption into Blackwood's beacon system, and whether she is still trying to warn mariners about dangers that officially no longer exist. If you are currently navigating Atlantic coastal waters and your GPS shows coordinates anywhere near 41.2847 degree N, 69.9584 degree W, you should immediately change course and contact the nearest Coast Guard station. Check your current location. Listen for 15-second lighthouse beacon patterns in areas where no lighthouses exist. If you hear radio transmissions from vessels that were lost years ago, you may have encountered another supernatural maritime trap. Elena Santos paid the ultimate price to expose Devil's Point, but her testimony suggests that Blackwood's techniques may have been replicated at other locations along the Atlantic seaboard. Your navigation equipment should be functioning normally if you are in safe waters. If your GPS coordinates are showing impossible readings, if your radio is receiving transmissions from dead voices, if you can see lighthouse beacons where none should exist, then you are already being drawn into a supernatural maritime trap. Elena Santos's final transmission may be your only warning before you join the thousands of mariners whose voices call eternally across dark Atlantic waters, forever trying to guide others away from the deadly lights that claimed their lives. The recording ends here, but Elena's warning continues. Every mariner who hears this testimony becomes part of her effort to prevent future maritime disasters caused by supernatural lighthouse operations. Share Elena's story with other sailors, report any anomalous lighthouse activity to maritime authorities, and remember that some dangers to shipping cannot be charted on any navigation system. Elena Santos died to bring you this truth about Devil's Point Lighthouse. The least you can do is listen carefully to her warning and watch for the signs she died trying to reveal. Because somewhere in the Atlantic darkness, supernatural beacons are still calling to ships, and the voices of dead mariners are still trying to save the living from sharing their fate. This recording has now been heard by 4,847 people. 43 listeners have reported similar encounters with impossible lighthouse beacons. 7 vessels have changed course after hearing Elena's testimony, potentially avoiding supernatural maritime traps. But 12 mariners who heard this recording have since disappeared in Atlantic coastal waters, their vessels found empty and drifting with no crew aboard. The pattern is clear. Elena Santos' testimony saves some lives but also marks others for supernatural targeting. By listening to her complete account of Devil's Point Lighthouse, you have become part of the ongoing battle between the living and the dead for control of Atlantic shipping lanes. The question is no longer whether supernatural maritime hazards exist, but whether you will survive your knowledge of their existence. Elena's final transmission contained coordinates for 17 other locations along the Atlantic coast where similar supernatural lighthouse operations may be active. These sites correspond to areas of high maritime casualties that cannot be explained by natural hazards or human error. Each location shows the same pattern: systematic vessel disappearances, erased shipping records, and local maritime legends about phantom lighthouse beacons that guide ships to destruction. If you are a mariner working Atlantic coastal waters, check these coordinates against your planned routes. If your shipping schedule takes you near any of these locations during storm conditions, consider alternative courses or delayed departures. Elena Santos died to provide this information, and her ghost may still be trying to save your life. But remember, knowledge of supernatural maritime hazards comes with a price. Every person who learns the truth about Devil's Point becomes a potential target for other supernatural entities operating along the Atlantic seaboard. You have heard Elena's complete testimony, and that knowledge has changed you in ways you may not yet understand. Check your current battery level. If it matches Elena's device when her transmission ended, you should immediately seek shelter and contact maritime authorities. The supernatural forces that destroyed Elena Santos